We have a few minutes to take some questions. Any questions about the presentations that were just concluded? We have microphones.
I have a question for Dr. Pooley. You've mentioned about the PLS. Not familiar with the disease, but does that become ALS, or is it part of sub class of ALS? Could you clarify that?
So most of the cases of PLS do not. They remain as PLS, but there are occasional cases where it transforms and the patients are progressing very, very slowly, and then something changes with their disease, and now they're progressing more like an ALS patient. So that does happen in a fair number of patients with PLS.
So is it PLS or bulbar palsy, are they related, or most of the PLS patients have a bulbar?
So PLS patients tend to start much more in the limbs, but they almost always eventually do develop speech trouble as well. You mentioned progressive bulbar palsy. That's usually starting with more upper motor neuron as well, and that's probably why it tends to progress slowly as well, like PLS does.
My husband is from Helsinki and has the familial C9 gene and was diagnosed in December with ALS, FTD. And I was wondering about the metformin study because he has already been on metformin for low dose for diabetes. So are we talking a much higher dosage that you're looking at in your study?
Well, the first study we did was very much an academic study. There was no placebo. Everybody was on medication, and we were looking specifically at, do we lower these abnormal proteins? A second part of the study would have been, does it have an impact on disease? But we really don't have a placebo arm, so we can't say, is it better or not? We can just get a rough estimate. That's what the next study would be going to do. And the dosing, if you're asking specifically about that, we were using diabetes dosing.
Okay.
So he may have been on the correct dosing. I can't comment specifically about yours and how it went with the dosing. But for that particular, there's animal evidence that it works. The goal of that trial, and again, we're awaiting the results, is for human evidence, and that the same thing that we're seeing in the animal studies. I want to emphasize, and again, metformin, as you know, for diabetics, it is a complicated medication. It's not as simple as there are people out there saying the entire world should be on metformin because it prevents aging. That's not true. It has side effects. So it is not for everybody to just take. It has to be taken in specific settings with the right, either as part of a clinical trial right now, but if we have evidence, then a more broader in the future, if we get that.
And this is more related with the C9?
With the C9
And
disease,
familial.
correct,
Okay.
correct, which you said he has. And I will, let me just a little sales pitch for some of my colleagues that have very active C9 programs going on, and I think Dr. Oscarson may have one or two other comments he may want to.
Yes, thank you. The C9 mutation was initially discovered by one of the Mayo Clinic groups, and we have a very strong programmatic interest in C9 disease. We do collect samples from people from C9 families before they have disease, if they're at risk of disease, so to speak. Some people never get disease even though they carry the mutation, and certainly on people with either ALS or FTD or both. So if you're interested in volunteering, we would love to have you.
Let's talk after.
What's that?
I said, let's talk after.
Other questions?
Could you explain the difference again between PMA and ALS?
So as some of my colleagues have kind of explained, that ALS is a very heterogeneous disease. There's spectrum spanning from lower motor neuron involvement only to upper motor neuron involvement only. The upper motor neuron involvement only would be the PLS, and the lower motor neuron involvement only would be the PMA that you're referring to. And the reason why we make this distinction is, one, because we don't really know the pathophysiology for really any of these things, but it also affects the prognosis of the patient. So it's kind of an older term, but it kind of reflects lower motor neuron only phenotype.
I only want to add that so upper motor neuron is when you're very tight, very slow movement, not so much atrophy. Your reflexes are very quick. So that's the upper motor neuron feature. The lower motor neuron is when you see the fasciculations, the muscle atrophy, the reflexes go away. So this upper motor neuron, where they're so tight and slow, is the one that progresses slow. And when your muscles get really weak, atrophy, fasciculating, these twitching movements, that's the lower motor neuron. So that's the two spectrums they're trying to translate in, but you may experience yourself.
And I'll also butt in. So it is kind of a spectrum, probably. It's not necessarily different diseases. It's kind of this motor neuron concept. We've talked a lot about this SOD1 type ALS here, this genetic form. Often those patients have PMA. It's really kind of the phenotype they have, whereas on the C9 side, we normally see more upper motor neuron dominant disease. Sometimes pure PLS even, but kind of more upper motor neuron dominant.
And I'll just say that, you know, if you do an autopsy in a patient who has PLS, they have lower motor neuron damage in their spinal cord and their brainstem. It's there. So it's, you know, there's no such thing as being all the way at the end or one end or the other. So the PMA patients, they have upper motor neuron damage if you do an autopsy. So all the motor neurons are affected. It's just the proportion is high, you know, upper motor neuron in PLS, and it's high in PMA, but the lower motor neuron. But all the motor neurons are affected in every form of motor neuron disease, basically.
And that's why we treat each patient very individually, because we usually say that one person's ALS is not another person's ALS, so we try not to group everyone into the same trajectory of disease. We take it on an individual basis.
So as the understanding of the molecular underpinnings of ALS are continuing to be discovered, can you just talk a little bit about the exclusionary criteria that you use for the shared placebo? Because how are you able to make sure that you've got the right placebo group and the right group as you define this more? I see you laughing. I want to hear this answer.
I'll let others, but I'll jump in first with one simple answer. Really good statisticians. Okay. They have, in particular with this Healy study, and I'll let Dr. Lucatelli touch base in a second because he's done a fair amount of work with the core group, but they have done a tremendous amount of modeling to make sure. And one of the beauties, I think, of this Healy trial is because that's what I was mentioning, that placebo component allows you to come in and now with complicated statistics reanalyze everything that you thought before and say, was I right? And how can I now modify the whole protocol going forward? So in a sense, the whole project itself is breathing because it's allowing for adjustments in itself as we go through and study it. And you have all of these wonderful consortium. Our Natural History Consortium was one of the groups they looked at in developing the Healy trial and how they would do it to address your specific question. How can we do this if we create these different groups of patients? So the short answer is really, really good statisticians.
But I think
So is this something where like drug A has one exclusionary criteria and drug B has another one? Or you're just randomizing everything and then after the fact, you're analyzing what actually happened with each individual
So-
patient? Or am I
So
misunderstanding this?
the Healy trial is really started with 4 drugs, so 4 regimens, A, B, C, and D. And there's something called the master protocol. So when you are included in the study, you have to have ELS, you have to have this condition, your breathing. These are things that you have to have, and these are the things you cannot have, inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. Once you come in, then the computer takes you to A, B, C, or D randomly. In the first place, we don't know any of the regimens are better than the others. Each of the regimens will enroll 3 patients and then 1 placebo. So the placebos of A, the placebos of B, the placebos of C, and the placebos of D are all analyzed together because they didn't have active treatment. So we can share that. The second thing that is kind of important is to know that the randomization, it has the 6 months of placebo. At 6 months, you end that and you move in what is called the active treatment extension. So everyone will be taking the drug. So it's only 6 months of placebo, then you move into active treatment, waiting for the last patient of any of these arms to complete the study. So some people will go 6 months placebo, but then for sure we have 6, 8, 9, 10 months of medication as well. When the drug says doesn't work, then that arm will be terminated. Also, there's a concept of doing at the time, because as we move into the other regimens, E and so forth, things have changed. Medications were approved or not, or now not approved, and then so it's not the same. So there's different standard of care changes. So you cannot use a placebo for 4 or 5 years to what it is now. So the historical placebos, the FDA would not accept them. So we still need to be forced by the FDA that something works needs to be of a real-time placebo. So it's a requirement by the FDA to say that this is good against placebo. So if not, it doesn't work. So that's kind of the idea of the placebo. I hope clarifies it a little bit.
I'm going to take a quick minute to welcome Dr. Tauhidi to the stage and ask him to quickly introduce himself, and then I think we are ready to go ahead and we'll start our Ask the Docs panel, and we can continue with questions from the audience. Dr. Tauhidi?
My name is Vahid Tauhidi. I'm the ALS Director Clinic of Orlando Health. And we have ongoing about 80 patients in our clinic. We became certified, one of the certified centers for excellence by ALS Association last year. And I'm kind of honored to help the patients and the families with ALS in Orlando area.
Thank you. Next question. Do we have one?
My name is Bud. Backing up for just a moment, a simple question, I believe. But I think I understand the difference in the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. If you have the core muscles that are not working, what is that called? And then what is it called if you have all 3?
So for any muscle that you want to move, you have a connection from your brain going to the muscle. The first step in that path is the upper motor neuron. The second step in that path is the lower motor neuron. So it's really kind of a signal that goes through 2 steps. So you can get weak from a break in either of those 2 steps. Now, if the second step breaks, the one that's the furthest out, closest to the muscle, we tend to see wasting, severe weakness, twitching, and if the upper link is broken, we see some weakness, but it's often milder. We see stiffness and clumsiness, but both needs to be there for a normally functioning muscle. So you can have upper motor neuron problems in your feet. You can have lower motor neuron problems in your face.
All right, thank you.
Oh, Same for core muscles.
Hi. Have you discovered any other mutations genetically that, other than SOD1, that is affiliated to ALS?
So the question was, do we have drugs targeting other mutations? So there is ongoing studies led by Columbia and Ionis that are targeting the FUS mutation that look pretty promising. We have a project targeting the CHCD10 mutation that looks promising. We've done gene-stopping drug attempts at the C9 gene expansion. Unfortunately, they failed, so I mean, it's not something we're pursuing actively at the moment. We've tried it at targeting the taxin2 mutation, and there are other genes that we think might be amenable to that kind of selective sort of targeted approach. So we are bolstered and excited about what's seen in SOD1, and we're hoping that, I think we might be seeing the same thing in FUS, and then that we're going to be able to do this for a few more mutations at least.
Barbara?
Yeah, maybe just say a couple things. So I work a lot with the Atlas study, which is the SOD1, which is ongoing. And what we really like about Healy, for example, is it's a massive trial. It recruits tons of patients, and it makes people have the option to try a new drug. I think the drugs which I'm most optimistic for and hopeful for are the ones that are really targeted at a specific population. Much like when cancer was first discovered, there's a huge variety, huge spectrum of diseases within the cancer. I think very similar processes occurring with ALS, kind of understanding that not everyone's ALS is the same, not everyone's cancer is the same. So I think that if we focus in on specific genes, we'll have a lot of success, and hopefully the success with genetic treatments will translate to the broader ALS group as well.
In the front?
I was diagnosed in April with bulbar owls with a genetic gene called TBK1. I know that's attached to my genetic family approximately. Was informed it's a very only a few patients have had this gene with my amazing doctor, Dr. Locatelli. But is there any doctors or researchers that have or can do more research on that gene and trials with that particular gene?
So I do have some patients with TBK1 mutations. We don't have a very active program for it ourselves. But there are a couple of groups that are. So there is a group at UC, University of California, San Francisco, that studies TBK1 ALS. Dr. M something. That we have sent samples to, fibroblasts. And I know that Dr. Tim Miller at Washington University is looking for samples from people with a true stop mutation in the TBK. So not just a minor variant, but something that stops the gene. I think that he is relatively close to some kind of gene-enhancing drug, because this is not a drug where we want to shut the production down. We want to actually increase function. So we can't tackle it with the type of gene-stopping drugs that we are working with right now. So those are two people I know have advanced programs on that. Dr. Mordes at the UCSF.
We're going to get in touch with those two centers very soon.
Other questions in the audience? I'm going to take a minute then to ask one of our prepared questions that was submitted early in advance, and we have a wide range of topics from clinical care to causes to treatments and genetics, all of it. So one person is asking about fecal microbial transplantation as a potential treatment for ALS. Any of you comment on that?
So there has been research into the gut microbiome. So Dr. Bedlack, who's spoken at this conference multiple times, he said when he first was approached about this, he thought they were saying fetal, like, newborn baby kind of thing, or, before they're even born, fetal transplants. But they said, no, fecal transplants, like, your poop. And so the ALS is not the only disease where people are looking at this, and there are some differences in what they call the gut microbiome. It's basically the types of bacteria that are present in your gut. And it's still early. There's, nobody has shown a study that, this I'm going to do fecal transplants and it's going to cure ALS or something like that so far. But there's a lot of interest in it.
And then this is a clinical question. Why am I so cold all the time, and why do I constantly yawn?
All right, so, so this excessive yawning is pretty common in ALS. It is, I think, linked to bulbar and upper motor dysfunction. I think baclofen is normally the drug I have the best luck with treating that. The cold limbs are a very common feature of ALS. It was also seen in polio back in the day when polio was very common. And I think it mostly reflects the atrophy of the muscle and that it's sort of a secondary change, the supply and demand thing that you don't really need to pump that much blood there. There are some subtle changes to the autonomic nervous system in ALS that might be contributing, but I think that it's normally a really weak and wasted muscle that gets really cold. Warm socks, sometimes calcium channel blockers tends to be what I use for that.
And I think that you have to add this point that, a lot of this heat that we have in our bodies because of our activities. So ALS patients have less activity. They have the muscle loss, they have the weight loss, and the weight loss is not just the muscles, also will affect the insulations around the muscles. So that's why naturally they feel colder.
Any questions in the audience? If not, I'll move on. Okay. We have one in the second row. Wait for a mic.
I know all the doctors in the world are looking for the cause of ALS, and you've talked about it, but I just wanted to know how far you are for finding out what really is causing ALS. What's the trigger, and what are the possible causes for ALS?
I'm looking forward to the answers of the others and the panel. What I can tell you is 10 to 15% seems to be genetic. There's probably around 100 genes and many different variants. But we also know even those genes that are pathogenic, so they're causing, they have to have some sort of an environmental trigger. Might be just aging, but it might be other things. So the cause is not one. This is not COVID. COVID, you test it, is a virus, we know what it is, and we find the cause. This is probably a constellation of different disorders. So we will not find the one cause. We have many different causes and then different triggers of some of those causes. So it's quite complicated. We do work on the assumption that many of these different causes ultimately go into one channel that it sort of expresses itself into the motor neuron problem, the neuron on the brain that controls movement. So what are the common pathways, all different conditions that end up being causing problems in that specific region of the brain? And then can we find something that is more broad-based, that is going to help everybody, and then trying to help to, without knowing every cause, can we actually, improve and prolong the survival, arrest it, and reverse it? As we know, if we know the exact genetic cause, then you may have a very specific cure for that version. But it's complicated answer because we kind of agree that different causes. And for some, if we know they're very specific, they may have a very specific treatment, but there's many causes.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that Dr. Locatelli says. I think we know, I just want to share with the group that there are people that study the disease and using models that it has been shown is a 6-step process. So rather than one single cause, we know there are multiple types of genetic mutations that lead to the disease. I think of it as what are the risk factors? And when they are combined, then the people having been exposed to multiple risk factors, and they are more prone at risk of developing the disease. The genetic cause will really guide us, to find out what is the pathway for that type of patient. But we are dealing with the other side of the genetic causes and diseases. That's why we want to study the pre-symptomatic people. Not everybody with C9 will develop C9 genetic expansion. Not everyone will develop ALS, right? So a lot of the ALS research is also working on the environmental and genetic interactions. And I think that is the future of the research to get us closer to maybe we can talk about preventing it. How do we lower the risk of developing this disease? And I think we are moving closer and closer, I would say every year. We know there are some common risk factors, like lead exposure, having served in the military. Smoking is actually a risk factor as well. And certain type of physical trauma, lightning, right? But it's not that one of the event will cause the disease. So it's complicated, but I am hopeful that we will be better at getting to the treatment.
I mean, most of these things are risk factors. They're not like so head trauma is a risk factor. Having exposure to pesticides is a risk factor. Have exposure to blue-green algae is a risk factor. But these don't cause ALS. It's not like everybody who lives around this lake that has a blue-green algae bloom is going to all develop ALS or something like that. So it's not the cause, but it is a risk factor. And if you have enough risk factors, as Dr. Chen was saying earlier, there are these multiple hit hypothesis about, that you need multiple different things before you actually develop ALS. So that if you have a bunch of these risk factors, you have a much higher likelihood you'll get it. If you have only one of them, it's a lot less likely.
And I think we focus a lot on the villainous genes, the ones that we know cause the disease. But like we're saying that it's very multifactorial, and maybe taking a step back, that maybe focus in the future on the hero genes, the ones that are active in one person and not in another, and they both have the villain genes. And why does this one person get it, the other person doesn't? So maybe there's room to heighten the expression of hero genes and fighting the villain genes, to simplify it.
And I think we recently discovered like TMEM as a protective gene, and so that this sort of gene story is getting more and more complicated. But I was really what I was going to say was, I don't know, we don't have anybody from the National Registry here this year, do we? There was a table. There was? Okay, well, that is our main effort. So do go online. The CDC ATSDR has a registry for everyone with ALS. Go online, put your data in. Again, the data will eventually sort out these kind of risk factors.
Thank you, Dr. Oscarson. We have a question over here.
I was just sort of following up on this last one, because obviously certain cultures have a higher disposition to ALS. I mean, through my research, we found out that Sam, being from Finland, Finland has one of the highest diagnosis rates of ALS globally. And so obviously we're wondering why that would be a factor, or how that plays into the sort of global research arena.
So the C9 mutation it's argued, there's Swedish researcher who claims that it's come from Sweden, and there's Finnish researchers claiming that it's coming from Finland, but it's either Sweden or Finland. That's kind of the origins of the C9 mutation. And that goes a few thousand years back. There's also a lot of SOD1 in that part of the world. So there's some particular variants of SOD1 that are a bit unusual. But yes, different parts of the world have different risk of developing ALS. In the US, we also still see that there's north to south gradient. So people living a bit more northerly are more likely to develop ALS than people are living more southerly. So much, again, of what we see with the genes have to do where, many gene changes occur anew at some point. I guess they will do. But for the C9, we can trace that back a long time.
Yeah, and in the medical field, sometimes if you come across, we call that the founder's effect. Like the genetic mutation can be traced back to the ancestors in the region. Yeah.
And as a follow-up question to that too, someone was asking about what are we learning from other neurodegenerative diseases? The MS has that north to south gradient as well. And
So there's been a lot of study of what's accumulating in the cells in the nervous system, and that's what these neurodegenerative diseases have in common. That they tend to have a protein that is somehow altered or damaged. It gets misfolded, and it becomes like impossible for the cell to degrade it. And so builds up, and this, we think, has some toxic effect, that what's building up is different in ALS than it is in Parkinson's, than it is in Alzheimer's. There's some things that cross over between the diseases, but in general, there's an abnormal accumulation of some protein that we think is probably having a, impact on in the development of the disease.
Another aspect of this fact that Dr. Pooley mentioned, that this accumulation of proteins that should be managed, like waste management issue, is the area of the brain. So if you have it in motor area and spinal cord, then we'll have ALS. If it goes in the back of the brain, then we have the different neurodegenerative disease. If the central part is Alzheimer's, so every part of the brain that is mostly affected, primarily, there are a lot of areas of the brain that might be affected, but primarily there's a different neurodegenerative disorders. And we have a term, ALS plus that. Most of those cases when kind of progress and this degeneration kind of spreads, we get to the point that we have clinical symptoms of kind of between of those neurodegenerative disease. So that's a very important question, because if you have a good breakthrough in one of those neurodegenerative diseases, there might be a lot of hope for ALS also.
thank you, Dr. Tahiti. Do we have a question?
Hi. Can you put into perspective ALS versus other motor neuron diseases? We say between 40 and 100 possible genes can be involved with turning on this disease. How does that compare to other motor neuron diseases that have been identified, what causes that to happen? And does the extreme number of genes delay also finding a cure?
All right, it's a tricky question. Well, so we have the So motor neuron disease sometimes is used synonymous with ALS. Sometimes it's used as an umbrella diagnosis to include other diseases. It gets into a lot of semantics here. We have Kennedy's disease, which is a bulbospinal muscular atrophy. That's a motor neuron disease. It's the problem, the androgen receptor. So it only really strikes men or severely strikes men. That's a different entity. We have the spinal muscular atrophies. There you have a loss of a gene function instead, and they tend to start very early in life rather than be late onset diseases. Those are kind of the other diseases that I really myself call motor neuron diseases sometimes. Then we have sort of ill-defined conditions like monophasic motor neuron disease, where somebody gets suddenly weak and then they get better. There's lots of things that we sometimes call motor neuron disease that's not really well defined. And we have strict research definition for ALS, we have research definition for PLS, and I think these other genetically defined conditions are also relatively straightforward to define. But then when we use the term motor neuron disease, it's really kind of lots of different things. Different people talk about different things when they use that term, and in different contexts, we probably also use that term with different meaning. The fact that it's different genetic underpinnings behind the disease probably is one of the important factors why it's taken us, well, we're not further along. Again, at some point, there's a lot of similarities. I mean, we are ALS doctors. When we look at somebody, we see a disease that we call ALS. We know it when we see it. And again, at some point there in the molecular pathways, it leads to death of the motor nerves. And that's kind of the defining feature. At that point, things are coming together. But if the origins truly are vastly different and unrelated, we are going to be needing to tackle them one by one. We could get lucky and hit something downstream that's really important for everything. We're certainly trying. But where we had luck is a little further downstream, where we shoot at a more clearly defined target.
I really think that your question is very clever, because we don't know. We really don't know exactly. And if you look at a couple of things, in general terms, it takes us over a year to diagnose it, because it's confusing to understand what is what. And second, some people show up with these features, some people with the other feature, and then a genetic testing points it to you, oh, this is clear, this is what it is. So because it's a large number of disorders, a number of things, we don't have that test that tell us quickly, this is this, and be able to differentiate that. Like I use the example of COVID. Some people have 0 symptoms and it's COVID. And some people, it is in intensive care unit and it's COVID. And why does it happen this and this? It's a single agent causing something. There's a test to tell us it's COVID. But then there's the person that has COVID. And it can be a young, robust person that has no symptoms, can be maybe somebody in a nursing home and gets into intensive care unit. So the person is holding a problem. So these genes and these things are in somebody's body. And the way we fight that condition back, it can be stronger or weaker, so it's different manifestations. And unfortunately, we still don't have that one test to tell us. We're getting closer with these genes that say, well, something's wrong with these genes. But then we also told you, well, depends, what else, what other hits did you get? 1, 2, 3, or 10 risk factors to add to that. And in addition, you need all your genes, whether you're tall, short, different parts of the world. How do you defend yourself about something strange? So medicine is complicated, and unfortunately in ALS, we still don't have that magic cause, one single one. And we had to deal with aging in the background, we had to deal with stress in the background, different nutrition in the background, different exercising. All of this is part of how you fight the disease, and how it's so difficult to actually give an answer like this, one short answer. It's multiple things, and it's complicated. But that's why now we're going into different collection of sources of data and have computers to help us to analyze these multiple data. And I think we're getting a lot closer. And then I'm surprised that still in a meeting like this, we haven't mentioned artificial intelligence. So it's like that is going to get us closer to the diagnosis, it's going to get us closer to these things. And there's controversies, the good and the bad of AI. But I certainly think that for medicine, is going to be a big plus. And I think it's going to accelerate the findings. So it took us a lot of time to learn this, but it's probably going to take us 1/5 of the time for a lot more knowledge in the coming years. So it's going to be a lot of faster because we have now tools that are going to help us with that. So it's hard to predict the future nowadays with this technology, but I think that is bringing, at least to me, a lot of hope that finding cures for ALS is a lot closer than we think it is. But it's hard to predict when, but I think it's faster, at least in my hopeful opinion.
We had a number of questions submitted about genetic testing and genetic counseling. And I have to remind everyone, if you weren't here earlier, that the ALS Focus Survey is launching, and they're going to be asking questions about genetic testing and genetic counseling. Can the panel, where are we with who should be tested, who should consider getting a genetic test, and what about family members? What is your advice and recommendations?
So I think, so that's an important question. I mean, we have the cases, just recent one actually in clinic. We had then a patient has ALS with one of the mutations, sometimes very obvious, sometimes questionable, or very rarely. Then they question that's why the family should be tested or not. So the answer is always no, because we start with the symptoms. If person has the symptoms, then clinically we go and then we test it, unless we have a treatment or something prevention. So that recommendation is that you just by being tested, then you might get some answer like some mutation. But what do you want to do with that? Do you have something to prevent or just affects your style life? Yes, I mean, you follow the certain rules to have healthy lifestyle, but testing without any symptoms is not recommended unless we have some kind of prevention for that. Of course, some of the colleagues might have more details about that, but that's a general statement.
I'm just going to make a plug. So one of the studies that we do at University of Miami is a pre-symptomatic natural history study. It's in part one of the reasons why we have some useful data about the NFL and some other biomarkers that we've discovered. And I'm using the royal we. It's mostly Dr. Benatar. But I think that it's a very nuanced decision. I think that it's, if you don't have symptoms, there's really no rush. The goal of the ATLAS trial is to see if we can prevent ALS from happening in a very specific gene. But right now, like you're saying, there's nothing actionable. But there is an opportunity potentially, if you want to participate in a natural history study, to contribute to developing new biomarkers and maybe even new treatments.
I think that most ALS doctors' approach has changed in this regard, since there is a treatment for at least one form of genetic ALS now, that we should test everybody. There was debate about this. I mean, we were in California like 3 years ago, and we had a discussion about this, and it was almost 50-50 about whether people were testing everybody, testing some people, was it only in people who had a history of ALS or frontotemporal dementia in their family or something like that. Because at the time, there wasn't any treatments available, so it's like, well, even if we do the genetic testing, we find a gene, we don't have a treatment that can impact that genetic diagnosis. So some people are like, what's the point of bothering to do the test if you can't do anything about it once you make the diagnosis? You're going to still treat them the same way as a sporadic ALS patient who doesn't have a genetic cause. But since this SOD1 drug, tofersen, has come along, I think the philosophy has changed, that almost everyone is recommending that we do genetic testing on all patients now.
I can, just one point to emphasize about genetic testing. It's not as simple as Ancestry.com. And that's what I taught, as I'm counseling patients regarding genetic testing, everything that was said is correct. We do have some treatment options, and occasionally we find somebody that we think is sporadic ALS that ends up with an SOD mutation. And so we will find those rare ones. So I do think it is reasonable to test everybody, but it has to be done in the setting of an appropriate genetic counselor or somebody talking about it, because the concern I have with just genetically testing everybody is we find things. We're human. We carry mutations. They may not be pathogenic mutations. And then you get a report back saying, you know, you carry mutation 1, 2, 3. And all of a sudden there's concern. Is this going through my family? Is this happening with that? And that's where getting appropriate genetic counseling for what are the implications of those results. So I agree that there are no treatments. I think in the future there will be, so gaining that knowledge can help us. An example being by the end of this year, if the metformin shows potential data, you know, we could think about that as a benign intervention as a bigger clinical trial. That would be types of things that could be an EAP type of approach when we were looking at it and with that testing. So that would be another one that would support it. But you have to be able to interpret those results. And that's where you need to do it with your doctor in a multidisciplinary, where we have appropriate genetic counseling to talk with you about these variants of undetermined significance. Do they really mean anything? And talking about those is going to be important.
I'll give you my thought on this. I attended a presentation from Dr. Matthew Hans last year in the Academy of Neurology, and he used the analogy because there's a number of gene panels. So you can say, well, let's test only SOD1 because we have a treatment. He went through a whole rationale and says, we should test the entire panel. So not just that, and there's rationale why. You know, caveat, we had to have counseling. So you have to test the entire panel, not just one gene, then the next, everything at the beginning. Second, who should be tested? If you suspect to have ALS, we think, because now pretty much all the panels are, you know, paid by somebody, so they're kind of free. So we test all the panels, all the patients. And why wait? If you know that your treatment is going to be more effective at the beginning, why going to test it next year or the other year? So if you know now, you're ready to receive a potential treatment. So we test now. So everything in the panel, everybody, all at once. And you've seen the movie.
Yes, and I would agree with that. And I tend to, so even at my institution, which is well-resourced, we tend to have delays of getting in with genetic counseling. And so I will order testing. I will do counseling to some extent, and then get the orders off. Should we have findings that are complicated, then I will really get my genetic team involved. And again, then we're talking about patients, people with ALS. The other question maybe that where this originated was, should family members of people with ALS get tested? That's a much more complex question, and there's no rush. There I would for sure send that person to a genetic counselor to talk that through before testing, test those results. If it's positive, it's really a heavy burden for someone, and being as well prepared for that as is possible, I think is important. If somebody has ALS, we are kind of running against the clock, and I don't like delays if I can avoid them.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I think maybe I didn't hear the question correctly, but I think what Dr. Tohidi answered first was that he would not test asymptomatic people, right? No. And I just want to clarify that. I think we all agree we don't recommend an asymptomatic people just to go ahead with any genetic test without a clinician's guidance. But if a patient has ALS and is seen in our clinic, at the time we make the diagnosis, next step, we do talk about genetic testing. And it is because as of now, 2024, we have the SOD1 antisense oligonucleotide treatment that's available. While it's rare, we do use the free genetic panel because there's no financial cost to people. But I think we're all saying the same thing, is we do it with the responsibility of having some counseling to the patients. And I usually tell them, if we do this, there are 3 possible outcomes. One is we can find a genetic mutation that has been shown to be associated with ALS. The second possibility is the panel comes back negative. It doesn't mean you don't have ALS. It just means we haven't found a gene that's known to be associated with the condition. And the third possibility is one of the genes, and it has a mutation, and the report says it's a variant of unknown significance. And that's more complicated, then we'll have to dig deeper and determine if we can test, your asymptomatic parents, and do they have the same mutation? Then that means maybe this mutation is benign, or then we'll decide what to do next. And I do some of that myself, but we think we would all agree some form of genetic counseling is important so people are aware what may be the outcome.
Dr. Carberry?
Yes, I need to probably to clarify, maybe that was misconception. Every patient with ALS will be tested genetically because even it's 1%, 2%, we have a SOD1 and there is a treatment. So there's no question about the patients with symptoms that to be tested. My point was about the family, which they're fine. They don't have ALS, they don't have symptoms. Should they be tested, all of them, if they're a patient, one of their relatives showed a positive gene? That was the question. Now, again, this is something that, as the colleague mentioned, they refer it to genetic counseling. But the general idea is that, at this point, maybe next year, maybe 2 years from now, when you have something to prevent, yes, that will be different. But at this point, right now, we don't have anything to prevent. If you want to follow with studies like Atlas and something like that, then that's another story. But right now, that's the statement for now.
Dr. Carberry, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think everyone's been very, very clear, and I agree with what everyone's saying. I've witnessed some tragedies where a patient will have a gene which is found to be pathogenic for ALS, and then in a scramble, the family all get tested, and then 2 kids have the same gene, and then it's as if, when you're trying to stabilize this patient who has a new diagnosis of ALS, it's almost like the whole family suddenly has ALS, and it's almost unmanageable. It's like a psychological breakdown that you just can't sustain it. So my advice is to, certainly if you have symptoms suggestive of ALS, you need to get tested with genetic testing. And then the family members, I think, should wait until they have had time to process what's happening with their family member, to give time for the family member to stabilize them, and then they can make a decision.
Marixa, I think we've stumbled upon a hot topic, maybe for consideration in next year's agenda. A lot of things to consider. Troy, did you have a question?
As researchers, I'm interested in your thoughts. Given the outcome with Relyvrio, do you expect the FDA to continue to exercise regulatory flexibility as new treatments come along, or do you expect them to perhaps retreat and become more conservative given the outcome with Relyvrio? And as a follow-up, if the FDA becomes more conservative, does that elevate the need or the urgency even more for biomarkers in order to open up greater options for accelerated approval using biomarkers as a alternative endpoint?
So I think you kind of answered the first question. They're gonna get shy on moving forward. But at the same time, I think the government now has here, the community of ALS lobbying to actually accelerate treatments. We have seen how they provide treatment with expanded access programs. In other conditions, biomarkers of some sort have changed the outcome of the trials. One of the main examples, multiple sclerosis. It was very complicated to measure, but the plaques in the MRI brains became the outcome measure of the trials, and an enormous amount of medications came on board, and they were more flexible to approve with the biomarker. There's a strong movement to find those biomarkers. Neurofilament and many others are looking into those, because if we do have some biomarker that shows that there's a change in the progression, then I think we're going to be moving faster with these trials, and the FDA will approve better if we find that. the ALSFRS functional scale, which is the main and primary outcome measure, has a lot of challenges, and I think that's one of the issues we're going slow. But other conditions have that, and then I think the ALS community and the researchers are looking for those biomarkers that we can, convince that there's an effective treatment by other means other than the ALSFRS. And I hope that comes really quickly. Maybe there's help with AI or some new change or some new scale or some true, biomarker that it changes the process of approving the drugs, so the government and the FDA will change that. And so I'm hopeful that's going to be, because the pressure is pretty high.
I think there were some clues that Relyvrio probably wasn't having much impact, like it did not impact the biomarker. So there was absolutely no effect on neurofilament with the drug. It was kind of hard to understand if a drug's actually having an impact on ALS, how it could not impact neurofilament at all. There's absolutely no difference in the drug and placebo. And, that was kind of a red flag up front. I think the use of the biomarkers in that sense can, if a treatment looks like maybe it's working, but there's no impact, I think that might be like, well, maybe we shouldn't move forward with this drug until we see something more. If there's, and there were some other red flags in the clinical trial as well.
Did you have a comment, Dr. Carberry?
I mean, I think that would be the logical conclusion to draw. I don't know if that's how it's going to play, but yes, it would seem reasonable to be more restrictive, getting drugs approved that don't work. Having gone through it, it's somewhat painful, certainly lots of work, complicates all the research projects that we're doing, and again, provides maybe some false hope temporarily, but I don't think it's worth it. And then for the biomarker for accelerated access, accelerated approval, that I think is more likely that it's more likely we'll see that. So yes, I believe that too.
I think that's a hard question, and so I don't think we don't work for FDA, and we don't know how. I don't think we can predict how they will behave in the future. It's just my personal opinion. I think it is disappointing, frustrating for everybody, right? But the process was actually going through as it should. And FDA was being, I guess, compassionate and looser, and with a lot of probably joint external forces, whatever the situation was. I am more optimistic. I would say I hope FDA will just do the proper review, and because we're developing and finding biomarkers, we're going to be able to, we are having information about how to use them. And I think the future trials, if the study drugs, should they get approved or not, will have stronger evidence. So I'm hopeful they're not just going to be conservative without a good reason.
Question in the front.
Because of the gene, the TBK1, how do we know if the Radicava or the Risole is helping if no one really knows a lot about the gene? Like the SOD1 is now taking a specific medication for it to help. Did I ask that right?
So we probably should be studying these drugs in the specific gene subpopulations. That's a major undertaking. We're not really gearing up to do that. I think the closest we can come to that are kind of individualized programs where you would take a drug, follow your own neurofilament, but that is not a particularly accurate way of gauging this. For the TBK1, we think that's probably a neuroinflammatory process more than maybe most ALS.
What process?
It messes with the inflammatory system. But we don't know that really the edaravone or the Relyvrio will be particularly addressing that mechanism. I don't think there's any suggestion that either will be particularly valuable there. Again, And so again, how sure could you be if you, with just yourself, an N of 1 trial with only you testing against your nerve filament? I think it's really a uncertain path to tread. I don't know that there's a better one necessarily either.
It's just that the gene is so rare, and that's what she has. And do you know with the TBK1 if they lived longer with those 2 medications?
I do not know of any specific TBK response to either of those two medications.
Okay, thank you.
I think we made the point, or some of my colleagues made the point earlier, that ALS being so heterogeneous and we kind of group together potentially a large variety of diseases, and we're looking and diagnosing based on potentially the outcome of many different processes. The TPK1 is maybe the first gunshot in a series of events that leads to ALS. But the medications that we use are not necessarily targeting that point in the process. Maybe it's further along, like the slide that you were using. It could be targeting a sequential step in ALS that's shared in multiple genes.
We're coming towards the end of the session, and so I just want to be mindful of time. I just have a few very, very quick questions to ask that were submitted in advance. One is, does anyone know about a trial medication called pridopidine, and if it will be available at the end of the year?
Pridopidine is one of the all arms of healing, so that has been studied. The double-blind phase ended, and the primary outcome, which was the ALSFRS, was not significant.
Okay.
So that we know. Now, there were secondary outcomes, speech and swallow particularly, that seems to have a benefit on it, and then it's not so clear whether it slowed down the progression to those particular symptoms. So there's now ongoing ideas to try to come with another study. In the meantime, the government has sponsored an expanded access program for pridopidine, so there's now active enrollment in few sites. We actually have the expanded access program for pridopidine. There's no placebo, it follows the criteria that I mentioned earlier today. It's an expanded access program for that drug.
Okay. Question in the back?
So I'll give you guys a layup question. Is ALS on the rise? And if it is on the rise, is it due to your ability to identify it early? Or is it environmental? What would be causing it to be on the rise if it is on the rise?
I think the National Registry answers this question. So this is one of the things the registry is good for. It's slowly rising with the increasing population and the aging population. So it isn't rising more than we really could see from just more people in the country and people getting older.
My opinion is that as we have awareness campaigns, the Ice Bucket Challenge and many other things, we are more aware of it. And as you know, the more aware people will get and the diagnosis will be done, because we are looking more, people more aware. So that, I think, is a contribution to, diagnosing more. I personally don't have a feeling whether there's more than before. I think there's more because we are counting more, but it could be also that there's more. But that I don't think that answer, and that's the registry's key, to actually go section by section, state by state, zip code by zip code, and country by country to see if there's other factors that are adding this. But I don't think we know the answer. I think we are seeing more clearly because we are looking more. The other question, and I think the registry and other epidemiological studies across the world will answer that question.
And one other part of the question you asked about diagnosing people earlier, and that's not happening, unfortunately, on average. And the problem is there's a lot of doctors out there who just are not comfortable to make the diagnosis. And so they won't make the diagnosis until it's absolutely definite. And by that time, any treatment you might have given the patient is no longer probably going to benefit them. And this is why we try to encourage people, get the patient to the ALS center. We will make the diagnosis. We will take that discomfort away from you. People just don't want to, they're afraid they'll be wrong. They don't ever want to label somebody with ALS, and they don't really have ALS. And so that's why they keep waiting and waiting and waiting. It's like, no, just send it to the ALS center.
Thank you, Dr. Pulley. I want to thank you all for your mentions of the National ALS Registry. You're all going to be my new spokespeople. I'm going to be reaching out to you after this. We have time for one more question, and then I'd like to ask the panel to leave the audience with a few closing thoughts, one sentence or less. We'll go down the row, and then we're going to conclude our session. So do we have a question in the back? I think yes.
Doctors, I'm a 5-month diagnosed ALS patient. When I was diagnosed in Ocala by the neurologist, pretty much told me to pack my bags, go home, and get my affairs in order. Nothing positive out of him at all. Of course, then I went to Gainesville and seen Dr. Weimer, who confirmed my diagnosis. And again, nothing, no guidelines to help me in any way until, of course, I could get on Riluzole, which I had an allergic reaction. I'll start Radicava next week. Is there anything such as Neuron that's on the horizon by the end of the year or after the first of the year? And also, have they looked at cannabis in any way in an effort to help with either symptoms or treatment or anything?
You asked a question about Neuron, which is the so-called stem cell trial. The most popular and most frequently asked question. It has to be the last question. The company is working on reopen enrollment with some changes on the inclusion-exclusion criteria and the methods of how to do it. It's probably going to be open by the end of the year or next year. I think they're talking about 20 sites. The details are still out there on the sites and the differences, but it seems that the company is looking forward to reopen to a new enrollment for Neuron. Is that specific question?
And when it comes to, again, cell therapies, it's the same as medications. There's really no end to the different kinds of cell therapies we can come up with. It's worth remembering that the brainstorm trial that was done was a well-crafted trial that did not show a benefit. It doesn't mean that there isn't a subset of patients who might be benefiting and another subset that's doing poorly with it. They're definitely actively trying to get another one off the ground, and the FDA will allow it. I mean, because that's kind of a question when you've already shown that something doesn't work, should you be allowed to expose more people to it? And the FDA are in agreement that this is a reasonable thing to do again.
Well, I guess what I'm primarily talking about is with my going home and getting my affairs in order and not being satisfied with that, I decided to hit the internet. Of course, Google, I shut that down. That took me down a dark hole of death. So I decided to hit YouTube. And of course, Dr. Bedlock was in there and a bunch of other doctors talking about a high vitamin regimen, B12, high dose B12 injections, which I'm doing, but not because it was offered to me by my doctor, but only because I took it upon myself to research that. And I wish the doctors, I understand it's not medicine and it's not a prescription, but why can't they give these folks when they're diagnosed with this terminal disease some sense of hope instead of telling them to go home and get their affairs in order? I mean, I understand it's terminal, but the doctor's got to be a little forgiving. Dr. Weimer was great, but my other doctor was not so great. So that was my question. Is I'm on a heavy vitamin balance, high dose B12 injection. When I asked, he said, "Oh yeah, that's a great thing for you, Kevin. Why don't you do that? I'll help you get it." And he did, and I'm on it. And I don't know that it's working, but it gives me that little hope, and which is very hard to find when you're an ALS patient. Is hope. So that's what I was meaning by the doctors not being forthcoming in what can help you, other than go home and get your affairs in order, climb in a dark hole, and stick your head in the dirt.
Well, that goes right to the last thing that we were supposed to do, which is to try to deliver a message of hope to the ALS patients here. And I'm going to be very, very honest that 2 or 3 years ago, I wasn't very optimistic. The things that were coming to be studied for ALS, they weren't really targeting things that have been demonstrated to be associated with the disease, like what's the underlying disease process here. And I think there's much more understanding about pathways that are really important in the vast majority of people who have ALS, and that has given me a lot of hope. Because I think why the treatments that we have up to this point haven't really had a major impact is because they're not really targeting what causes the disease. And I think as we understand that better and have treatments that are targeting what look like they're probably really important mechanisms of the disease, then we're going to have something that can have a chance of really having an impact.
Thank you, Dr. Pulley.
Something that you can really see is doing something for patients.
Thank you, Dr. Pulley. Dr. Tahiti, your final thought.
Yeah, I think I kind of understand the hope is what makes the people going on and to exercise, to try to eat properly, to fight the disease. Yeah, so the hope is very important. But we as a physician, we are very careful about what kind of hope we should give them. We should be honest. We have to keep the integrity. So I think I agree with Dr. Pulley. There is a lot of hope now with all this new research. I mean, eventually there is an idea maybe ALS like cancer to be tamed. We'll find out about all these genes that involved, and each of them will find the treatment for that. So everybody gets the profiling and says, oh, you get this drug and this drug or this drug. And that's where we're heading, and there's a lot of hope there. But it doesn't mean that we kind of, or physician can recommend something that has not been shown to do anything, just to restore hope, because that kind of hope will be kind of not real. So while there is a lot of hope there and there's a lot can be kind of look forward, and of course all the colleagues and all this whole community are working on that. So I think there's a lot to be hoped.
Thank you, Dr. Tahiti. Dr. Oscarson, final thought for the day.
Trying to maintain hope in ALS is a challenge. I think there are many things that look really hopeful on the horizon as far as the science we're doing. But trying to goal set and again, living every day to its fullest, doing the things you can, focusing on the good things. We do have lots of things that make people's lives easier to live with. So much technology and equipment, things we can do. And we'll keep working. We're going to get there all the way soon. And we're getting there for some people already.
And Dr. Weimer had to leave early, so I apologize he's not here to participate. Dr. Locatelli.
I know you're engaging out in a private conversation, but I want to talk to the audience, but I want to get back your attention, sir. I want to talk to everybody, but I do want to talk to you. First, I want to tell you that I'm very sorry you had that bad experience. And I'm also very sorry that you're not alone on that story. It happens frequently. At least in our center, and I'm using our center, if you were to come to see our team, the first that I would tell you is you're not alone any longer. We will work with you all the way, every day, and have fluent communication on what's going to be. Second, you might be talking about these and these and these medications. There's many other things that slow it down. We have presentations on nutrition and breathing exercises, physical therapy, social support, many things that also will slow it down. Medications are not the only thing. Vitamin B12 is not the only thing. Clinical trials are the only thing. There are many, many things that it can be done. But the thing that I feel it hurts you the most is they left you out there by yourself to deal with this on your own, fighting with Google and trying to see. In our clinic, the entire team will be surrounding our patients. We can have lists to make sure we don't forget about any of them. We're going to be, supporting you all the way. We don't have a cure. We don't feel good about it, but there's many things that we can do. I think the team at this table, and we had an amazing meeting today, I don't think you will get that answered in any of these clinics. Guarantee you will not get in these clinics. That's why you had to get to these multidisciplinary clinics. We, the physicians, alone, we cannot do it either. We need our nurses and therapists and the entire team to support you. There's so many details. That's why you need a team. This condition is not for a single neurologist. It's for a whole team that is going to support you with all the information we have now. There are 60 compounds that we're trying to research in the world right now, trying to expedite to bring them to see which one may or may not work. That doesn't change the fact that we had to offer you all the other things that we know it worked. So I'm sorry your story, but I can tell you, find your right team close to your area, find that multidisciplinary clinic, work with them. There's a lot to do. And the goal that you have, whatever you have left, we all going to die, that we know. But whatever you have left with the team that supports you, it will change that perspective. You were shocked, you were left alone. I'm sorry for that, but that's not what is out there in every clinic. Get to one clinic and you will recover your hope and you will feel that you are with a team of people that will help you. And I may sound like a politician. I really feel like that a little bit. But it doesn't have to be that way, in my opinion. And there's in this table, the people that here, we know each other, you will not be treated like that. So find those clinics, and I think you'll recover your hope.
Thank you, Dr. Locatelli. Dr. Chen.
Yes, I think we're supposed to say what gives us hope. Okay, and I agree with everything Dr. Locatelli says. I won't repeat that. I have the same sentiment, and I'm sorry that patients do feel that way when they were first given the diagnosis. What gives me hope for ALS and for all people that suffer from it is the science that's being done and the biomarkers that are being developed at the recent national meeting. We are learning a lot about the different steps of this disease, and I truly believe that is what's giving us hope. And again, we cannot do it alone, so I really encourage all patients to try to consider and get connected, be in a study, whether it's observational or interventional. That will help us move the field forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Dr. Carberry.
I get to be the last one.
Yeah.
So I got into ALS because it was very easy to be compassionate and empathetic for the worst disease in the world. I moved to Florida because I wanted to contribute to one of the busiest and most productive research teams in the world. While I've been managing people with this disease, I've found it very easy to find a connection and to help shoulder some of the horrors that you have to go through. I'm very optimistic about the future. There's a lot of extremely smart, energetic, compassionate, and collaborative people that are working on it, and I think that this team here is a very good example of that. Like I said, we had a very, very nice meeting earlier today. So very hopeful for the future, very thankful for all the other components of the multidisciplinary clinic, because the neurologist is really just a fraction of that. And thank you so much for coming to visit with us, and hopefully we instilled some hope for the future. This is our career. For a lot of us, this is our life. So we'll hope to get there together.
Well said, well said. Thank you.
I have to say thank you to this amazing panel of doctors that we have here and the ALS treatment centers we have throughout the state of Florida. We are really blessed to have them. I do agree with everything that they were saying. People will call me in tears because they went to another doctor, and I always tell them, if you go to an ALS multidisciplinary clinic here in Florida, you will not get that treatment. I guarantee it. I don't know all of them personally that I've been in their clinics, but I know them enough to know that they are there for you. And you're amazing, all of you.